You know that quiet space inside your own head, that place you can retreat to where you can just be yourself? Well, imagine that space, that inner room, was slowly shrinking or maybe even vanishing altogether. In this explainer, we're diving into a really powerful idea from our source material about what happens to us and to society when that private world disappears.
So let's get on the same page. What are we even talking about when we say inner life? The source defines it as this protected mental space. It's where you get to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, have doubts, explore desires, all without someone constantly looking over your shoulder. It's basically the workshop where we build ourselves. But what happens when the workshop doors are just always open?
Right. So, what happens then? What are the real consequences for you as an individual and for an entire society when there's no room left to just figure things out on your own? To really dig into those consequences, our source material zeroes in on modern India. The argument is that this is a place where that inner room is very much at risk of vanishing, leading to a kind of life where there's almost no private self at all. The core idea here is that in modern India, your personal life is very rarely just yours. It feels like your family, your community, your whole society claims a kind of moral ownership over your choices. There's this constant inward pressure, which makes building and protecting that inner space incredibly difficult. So, what does that feel like day to day? Well, it's described as living life under a microscope, where pretty much everything you do feels like it's everyone else's business. And I mean everything. What you study, the job you take, who you marry, even who your friends are, what you believe, your sexuality, how you live. These aren't seen as just your decisions. They're treated like community projects. And here's the crucial part the source points out. What the community often frames as caring for you can feel, to the person living it, like a constant, suffocating intrusion. And what's the fallout from that? Well, when you feel like you need to get approval from everybody for every little thing, just being your genuine, authentic self starts to feel really risky. So you learn to put on a performance instead of just, living. And that constant performance, that need to conform, it comes with a pretty heavy psychological price tag. We're talking about hypocrisy, a ton of anxiety, and some really deep-seated repression. The source puts it so powerfully with this quote: "This is not hypocrisy by choice, it is hypocrisy by survival." So this double life people end up leading isn't some kind of moral failing. It's a coping mechanism. It's a strategy you have to adopt just to get by in a world with these intense social pressure. And this survival strategy creates a huge split. On the outside, you've got the public self, the one that's respectable, follows all the rules, and ticks all the right boxes. But then there's this hidden private self, which is often anxious, and because it has no healthy way to express itself, it can become indulgent or even reckless. The argument is, this doesn't build good citizens, it builds fragmented ones. And here's where the argument takes a really fascinating turn. The source suggests that when people are denied their own freedom, their own autonomy, all that frustration doesn't just vanish, it has to go somewhere. And often, it gets redirected outward as moral policing, aggressively judging and trying to control what other people are doing. This idea actually helps explain a lot, doesn't it? It explains why something as simple as a couple showing affection in public can attract so much anger, or why someone else's totally personal lifestyle choice can trigger mass outrage. In this kind of environment, just conforming gets mistaken for being a good person, and any deviation feels like a threat. So really, it all boils down to this. A society that's starved of inner freedom becomes obsessed with the lives of others. It just can't look away, because controlling everyone else becomes a substitute for the personal freedom that's been lost. Okay, so that's a pretty heavy diagnosis of the problem. But is there a way forward? Let's take a look at how we might start, building back the walls of that inner room, maybe by looking at what has worked in other places. So, what can we learn from other societies? Well, in many liberal democracies, privacy is seen as a kind of crucial infrastructure for functioning society, which really helps clarify who is responsible for what. In some East Asian societies, there's a different approach, a kind of quiet autonomy, where there's a fundamental trust that people will regulate themselves if you just give them the space. Now, these aren't perfect solutions, but they do show that finding a balance is totally possible. So, drawing on those kinds of ideas, the source proposes 4 gradual, adaptable shifts for India. First, normalizing boundaries, especially in families, so giving guidance without demanding total control. Second, separating morality from intrusion. Basically, judging actions by whether they actually cause harm, not just by which social norm they break. Third, teaching emotional literacy from a young age. And finally, actively reducing moral policing by protecting things that are perfectly legal and harmless from, social witch hunts. But at the end of the day, why does any of this really matter? Why is this inner life so important? Well, it's because it's not some kind of luxury. It's the absolute foundation of a dignified society. The source lays out a pretty stark reality here. A society that doesn't protect the inner lives of its people doesn't magically become more moral or stable. It just becomes loud, anxious, and controlling. It becomes a society built on watching each other because there's no trust from within. And this leads us to the most crucial point of all: true self-regulation. The ability to be a good person because you choose to be. That isn't something that's learned through constant policing. It's a skill. And it's a skill you can only develop when you have the freedom to choose, to maybe make a few mistakes, and to think for yourself without being afraid. As the source material so beautifully puts it, a civilization that truly values dignity must begin by protecting the most invisible space of all, the inner life of its people. And that really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? How do we start building a world where that invisible space isn't just tolerated, but is actually protected and treated as sacred?